Hello, my name is Kyle and I'm here with Tabletop Gamers today to talk to you about my personal ranking for the 7 roles that you get in the base game of Pandemic. So before I get started with ranking the roles, I do want to kind of clarify some of my approach to how I rank the roles. So the first thing that I'm looking for is the mechanic that the role emphasizes or focuses on. Because not all mechanics in the game are created equal. Some mechanics are just better than others. And so we want to kind of emphasize those particular mechanics. The other thing that I'm looking for is how niche is the ability? Is it something that just comes up in too specific of a scenario, or is it an ability that just is more generally good? And so those are the 2 things that I'm really looking for in the roles and how I evaluate them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about my ranking. So we're gonna go ahead and start off with the bottom rank. So 7th place here. And for me, the bottom rank is going to be the Quarantine Specialist. So the Quarantine Specialist reads this: prevent disease cube placements and outbreaks in the city that you are in and all the cities that are connected to that city that you're in. So the reason why for me this is the bottom tier is because this particular ability is very niche and it is reactive rather than preventative. So the Quarantine Specialist, you just happen to have to be in the city that the outbreak is going to happen at. And remember, all of the cubes and things like that is random. So you're not necessarily going to know where the disease cubes are being placed or where those epidemic cards are going to show up. So you're kind of having to guess and just kind of hope that you manage to land in the spot that the outbreak is occurring at. Now, of course, the mechanic that this role is focused on is super important because this particular mechanic is tied to 2 different ways you can lose. You can lose if all the cubes are put on the map, so that's one way. And then the second way, if you get too many outbreaks and your tracker gets all the way to the end, you lose that way. So this role is tied to an important mechanic in the game. The problem is that it is reactive rather than preventative. You have to kind of just know all of these things ahead of time. And on top of that, this role encourages you to essentially not remove cubes, right? Because if you remove the cubes from the board, then your ability is never going to come up. So this is why I feel that the Quarantine Specialist is in that bottom rank, because it's just an ability that may only come up once or twice in the entire game. And it's just if you got lucky and happened to be in the area when it happened. All right, so that's the bottom tier. Let's look at the next one. And this one is like I really struggled with, and that is the Researcher. So the Researcher says this: you may give any one of your city cards when you share knowledge. It need not match the city that you're in. A player who shares knowledge with you on their turn can take any one of your city cards. So the reason why this is not ranked higher, because let's talk about the mechanic first. Sharing knowledge is critical in this game. You need to be able to switch cards with one another so that the person who happens to have maybe more of a particular color, they just need like that one more card so they can develop the cure. Sometimes it's hard because you have to like move around the map to try to get in just coordinating the right spot to then trade knowledge. So sharing knowledge is a very critical mechanic to help increase the efficiency of your team. The problem here is that the Researcher only can give their cards in their hand away. It's not reciprocal. They can't take any one card from another player. It's only them giving up their cards to the other player. And so because it's not reciprocal, I had to really knock this one down. I think if it was, this would be probably one of the top cards in the game for me. But because of that fact that it's not reciprocal, it comes down to what if the Researcher has a crappy hand? What if the researcher does not have anything that you need? Well, then now you're not hardly ever utilizing the researcher's ability. And so because of that, that's why I put it at the 6th spot. All right, so next one. And this one, I really do like this one. It kind of reminds me of like Snapcaster Mage in like MTG. And that is the Contingency Planner. So the Contingency Planner reads this. As an action, take any discarded event card and store it on this card. When you play the stored event card, you remove it or exile it essentially from the game. You have one event card. You may only have one event card on this card at any time, which is not part of your hand. Okay, so the reason why I put the Contingency Planner at number 5, which is still kind of in that bottom half of the 7 card ranking here, is because what if people are not playing their event cards? Then you can't utilize the discarded cards. The other thing is, what if you don't land as many event cards in a game as you are hoping to? So you're kind of subjected to some RNG here. If you don't have any event cards available, then your ability is useless. So the mechanic is strong because there are some very strong event cards in the game. And when we did our pandemic playthrough, the Quiet Night event got played twice because Jonathan had the Contingency Planner roll. So that was a strong ability because we dodged the infection phase essentially 2 times. And so the Contingency Planner can really double up on some very powerful events. The problem is you're not guaranteed to see those events in the game. And so because of that, you run the risk of having a roll that ends up being not very useful in your particular playthrough. So it's got kind of that low floor, high ceiling roll to it. And so because of that, I felt that it's just not enough consistency to really be ranked higher. So that's why I put Contingency Planner at number 5. All right, now getting into that middle spot, the Operations Expert. It reads this. As an action, you can build a research station in the city that you are in, and no city card is needed to do it. Once per turn as an action, move from a research station to any city by discarding any city card. Okay, so the things I like about this card is that, let's talk about the mechanic first. You need research stations to win. You need those because research stations give you 1, mobility, because you can then shuttle around from station to station. So it gives your team mobility. And then 2, you need to be at a research station to discover a cure. So research stations are innately important to the game, and this particular role helps with that particular mechanic. So that's awesome. The other thing that I really like about the Operations Expert is high mobility. If you're at a research station, you can dump any card that you don't need and go to any part of the world. Mobility, I think, is extremely important in pandemic. You need to be in the parts of the world that that the problems are at, or you need to be able to quickly get to other players to share knowledge and things like that. So it's extremely important to be mobile, and this card has that. The reason why I have Operations Expert at number 4 and not higher is because of diminishing returns. So at the beginning of the game, the Operations Expert is really good because you got to get those research stations out there. You got to start building that stuff up. But you can only have so many research stations on the board. I believe it's 6. And so after a while, the value of putting down a new research station onto the board gets less and less as time goes on. So you have diminishing returns in the value of the Operations Expert role. And then when you get toward the late game, really the only value that the Operations Expert has is that it is a very mobile card, and it has given a good infrastructure onto the map for mobility, and that's it. So it's a very strong early game card, but not a strong role throughout the game, in my personal opinion. And so because of that, I had to put it at number 4. Okay, now we're getting into the top 3 here. And I want to note that I think there is a tier difference between the top 3 and the bottom 4. And that difference is that we're going from situational, niche type of roles that are good in very particular situations to cards that are just generically good. They are just very good all the time, in the beginning of the game to the end of the game. They just are generically good. So, rounding out the top 3, we have at number 3, the Scientist. So what does the Scientist read? You need only 4 cards of the same color to do the Discover a Cure action. So, it's a very boring card. It's not nearly as exciting as some of the other roles, but you gotta discover cures in order to win the game. So this mechanic that the Scientist is focused on is literally the mechanic that wins you the game. So it's an extremely important mechanic that this Scientist role card is tied to. The other thing about it is that it is just a generically good card. When we played our pandemic playthrough, I noticed that for Wes, who was our Scientist, there were times where he was like just literally getting cures without ever having to trade with anybody. He was just drawing cards off the top, and it just happened to mesh up with all the other cards he already had. And so he was just naturally discovering cures without hardly ever needing to work with other people. And a lot of times, the other thing with the Scientist is that you only need like 2 cards in your hand, 3 cards in your hand to all of a sudden be viable to be like, hey, I almost have a cure here. Does anyone have like 1 card that you can share knowledge with me? And boom, we get this thing locked up and done. So the reason why I say that is that that's a generically good ability. It's good in the beginning of the game. It's good at the end of the game. It's good throughout. So this generically good ability is why the Scientist is up in the top 3 rather than lower down on the ranking. But the reason why I don't think it's at the very top is because it's also a card that is locked into itself. It doesn't necessarily help the rest of the team. And I feel like because of the limited ability it has, even though it's a very powerful one, it's also kind of just a very boring vanilla card. So that's the Scientist. Let's go to number 2 here. So I rank number 2 as the Medic. Now, I believe some people would probably put the Medic at number 1. I'm putting it at number 2, and I'll give some explanations in a little bit here. So the Medic reads this: remove all cubes of 1 color when doing Treat Disease. And then the other ability is automatically remove cubes of cured diseases from the city you are in and prevent them from being placed there in the first place. Okay, so Medic is number 2. And when we draw a contrast between my bottom tier, the Quarantine Specialist, and the Medic is preventative, whereas the Quarantine Specialist is reactive. So that is a big jump between Medic and Quarantine Specialist. Medic goes in and just wipes cubes out. In one action, you only get 4 actions in a turn, and in one action, you are wiping out an entire disease in a city, whereas other people, it might take 2 or 3 actions to do the same effect. And then, of course, don't even get me started when you start getting cures. When you start getting cures, you're only spending 1 action period just moving into the city and removing everything. And so the mechanic that the Medic is tied to, which is removing disease counters or cubes from the map, which helps reduce the chance of outbreaks and therefore removes 2 of the possible ways to lose the game. Remember, one of the ways to lose the game is to have the outbreak counter go to the bottom, and the other one is to have too many cubes on the board. So the Medic can take away 2 of those possibilities there all by itself, and it is preventative instead of reactive. And that's why I have the Medic at number 2. It's just a very generically good ability. The Medic is strong at the beginning of the game when you have those handful of cities that have 3 cubes on them, and it's strong at the end of the game too, where you might have certain areas of the map where it's starting to pile up and it's looking like a very dangerous spot where a bunch of outbreaks could chain off. at one time. The medic can just hop right in there and like one turn potentially totally turn the situation around, whereas for other players it would take multiple turns to do the same thing. So that's why I have the medic at number 2, not 1, 2. So my top card, those of you that are pandemic players, veterans, you probably already know the role, and that role is the dispatcher. So what does the dispatcher say? It says this: move another player's pawn as if it were yours. As an action, move any pawn to a city with another pawn. You have to get permission before moving another player's pawn. Okay, why in the world is the dispatcher number 1 for me? And here's why. The dispatcher's mechanic that it's tied to is mobility. It's tied to movement. And movement is, in my opinion, one of the top mechanics in the entire game. You have to be where the problems are at. And not only do you have to be where the problems are at, you have to be able to get to each other to share knowledge. And you have to get to the research stations in order to discover cures. So the dispatcher literally can save you turns. It can save you entire turns and increase the efficiency of the entire team just by the high mobility that it gives you. Remember, it literally takes a player and moves them to another player. So like, I need to share knowledge with that player. Okay, dispatcher, you're gonna bounce me over there in one action. Now we're together, even if we were on the opposite sides of the map, we're now together. And on the next one of our turns, we're gonna share knowledge. We've literally saved so much time by doing that. And time is everything, because that ties to the third mechanic. The third mechanic, or third way of losing, I should say, my bad. The third way of losing is if you draw out all of the player cards in the player deck. So you are essentially timed. You only have so many turns in the game to win. And the dispatcher is going to help shave off those turns so that you can get done faster. So I think mobility is extremely crucial for all of those reasons. You got to get to the research stations, you got to get to each other to share knowledge, and you got to get to the potential outbreaks to fix them. And all of those things require mobility. And you want to be mobile, and the best way to be mobile is to have a dispatcher. Otherwise, you're throwing away cards in your hand that you could be using to discover cures just to get around the map. And so then you're kind of caught in this catch-22. Do I keep the card so that I can potentially discover a cure, or do I throw the card away so I can get over to the problem areas and fix those so we don't lose? And you're kind of stuck in that internal struggle, whereas the dispatcher can be like, don't worry about it, I'm going to get you there. So that's why I have the dispatcher ranked at number 1. I hope this video was helpful to you, and if you have your own personal ranking or view on some of the cards that I mentioned today, go ahead and let me know in the comments about your personal feelings about certain roles, and I'd be anxious to hear what you have to say. Also, go ahead and leave a like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. We just recently got to 100 subscribers, and we're going to keep on marching toward 1,000. As always, thank you for watching.